What if you could remember everything you ever learned without having to study nonstop? Well, there are scientifically proven ways you can do this and ace any test. If you've seen part 1 of this series, you know that building a high-performance study system starts with the purposes and rules that make it work. But this video will explain the actual study techniques you need to use if you want to do well on your next test. These evidence-based tips have the potential to maximize your memory in as little time as possible. But the first thing you need to know is that you can't afford spending time on ineffective study methods like highlighting, rereading notes, and summarizing. These are more passive study methods, and because they don't make your brain work very hard, you end up not remembering as much. If you want a more in-depth explanation of why you shouldn't reread, highlight, and summarize, watch the video from Ali Abdaal that's linked in the description. In this video, we're going to focus on the things you should do when you sit down to study, which we can divide into 2 broad categories: encoding and retrieval. Encoding is getting new information into your long-term memory, and retrieval is getting it back out when you need to use it. Whenever we encode something new, our brain decides how long it should be kept based on how much we need it, which we demonstrate by retrieving the information. When we do high-quality encoding and high-quality retrieval, we're able to understand and remember everything we need. So let's start with strategies for encoding. This is when we want to consume new material and understand it. First is finding and managing resources. You need to know what sources you should be learning from, like lectures, textbooks, or videos. If you're studying for a test that a lot of people take, like the MCAT or the GRE, look up what resources people found most useful and build a small comprehensive library that has everything you need to know. You want your resource library to cover everything, but make sure you don't overload it with repetitive information. There are more sources than you could ever possibly read, so figure out what you actually need and stick with that. The second encoding strategy is previewing content. Once you know your resources and how to access them, use them to preview the material for each day. If it's for a class with lectures, you should do this at least the day before the lecture. This prepares you to learn the material by giving you the first exposure to it. Briefly go through all the content for a given day and take note of all the words and concepts you don't know. Strategy number 3 is elaboration, and this is by far the most important part of encoding and learning the new information. Elaboration is connecting a concept to other things to solidify your understanding, which I tend to think of in 2 parts. First is contextual elaboration, where you contextualize and connect the concept to other things. To do this, you can ask yourself a few questions. How does this new information fit in with what I already know about this topic? How can this be connected to another similar topic? What's the story behind the information becoming relevant? Where can I place this information in a hierarchical structure of ideas? For example, if I was learning about how hemoglobin binds oxygen in the blood, I would think, okay, hemoglobin carries the oxygen with its heme group, which is a chelating agent. What chemical properties do I know about oxygen and metal chelating agents that make this possible? How does this relate to respiration and circulation? What would stop this process and what would happen if it did? These questions put what I'm learning into context so that they're not just isolated facts. It adds to the new information that my mental framework's already stored in my long-term memory, making the memory stronger. You can also do this visually by drawing out a spider diagram from memory with everything you know about a particular topic, forcing you to connect all the related ideas in your mind. Another way to use contextual elaboration is the Feynman technique, where you teach what you're learning to somebody else as simply as possible. This forces you to give context to the concept you're teaching, especially if the person knows less about it than you do. You can do this with other students, a friend, or even by yourself in the mirror. No matter how you do it, this conceptual elaboration will make it so you actually understand what you're learning. The other type of elaboration is artificial elaboration, where you connect the concept to unrelated things to help you remember it. I only use this type of elaboration when the information either doesn't fit well into a conceptual model or it's a list with a specific order I need to remember. For example, you can use the mnemonic, "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally," to remember the order of operations in algebra. The meaning of the phrase, "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally," has nothing to do with the order of operations, but it gives you a memorable mental cue because each letter is associated with one of the steps you have to do. Another artificial elaboration technique is the method of loci. Loci is it? This is one of the most powerful memory techniques. It's used by a lot of memory competition champions to remember long lists like entire decks of cards. I won't go into depth on it here, but essentially you connect your spatial memory to a list of things you need to remember. For example, you can assign one thing to each room in your house and then mentally walk through your house to remember each of the items. Alright, so encoding strategy 4 is establishing concrete examples. And this is particularly useful if you're having a hard time understanding a concept. If you can visualize a concept or attach it to a real-life example, you're much more likely to remember it. For example, say you're studying physics and you've just learned that when you disregard air resistance, things fall at the same speed regardless of their mass. This is counterintuitive because we don't really have experience without air resistance. We might think that something heavier will fall faster, but if you watch a video where someone makes a massive vacuum chamber and they drop a feather and a bowling ball at the same time, and you see those two things fall together, you've now seen a concrete example of the concept, and it'll be much easier to remember in the long term. You can do this with video videos, pictures, stories, lab experiments, or whatever else you can think of to better understand the concept. The last strategy for encoding is dual coding, and this is based on the notion that the more you're exposed to something, the more opportunity you give your brain to properly encode the memory of that thing. So dual coding is when you deliberately encode new information from multiple angles or sources, especially if you're having a hard time understanding it while doing the elaboration strategy. You can read textbooks or articles, watch explanation videos, review summary sheets, draw diagrams, write synthesis questions, or do anything else necessary to make sure you fully understand what you need to know about the topic. Once you've encoded the new material you're learning, it has to enter the retrieval side to tell your brain to keep it stored in long-term memory. This retrieval stage is the most important part of the entire study system. Retrieval strategy number 1 is spaced repetition, which is the idea that the rate at which you forget something decreases over time the more you review it. This works best when you review it right before forgetting it at increasing intervals. For example, you could learn something on day 1, then review it on day 2, then on day 4, day 7, and so on. This keeps your studying to a minimum because you're only reviewing the things you actually need to review on any given day. When you're dealing with a small number of things, you can make a schedule for when you're going to review each thing. But when you're learning a lot of new information, it can become impossible to keep track of it all. The very best thing you can do for this is using an app that keeps track of everything for you, and I highly recommend using Anki. It's a free desktop flashcard app that uses a spaced repetition algorithm based on the feedback you give it on each card. So if you know one thing really well, it's not going to test you on that very often. The other thing I love about Anki is that it incorporates active recall, which is retrieval strategy number 2. Active recall is forcing yourself to remember a fact or concept without notes. This is also one of the most beneficial things you can do to learn things faster because it tells your brain to solidify the information in your long-term memory as you're actively retrieving it. You can use any flashcard system to access the power of active recall, but I highly recommend using Anki because its scheduling algorithm does the heavy lifting and spaced repetition for you. If you use the strategy of elaboration at this stage, it's also a form of active recall because you have to recall your entire understanding of the concept. This lets you see where you might not fully understand something, which can prompt you to go back to the encoding stage on some concepts to relearn them. In addition to using Anki, I recommend doing this by drawing out spider diagrams or using the Feynman technique just from your memory. Retrieval strategy number 3 takes active recall to another level by applying it to your specific testing format through practice questions. This is another holy grail of study strategies because it gets you to recall the information in the way you'll eventually need to recall it on the exam. You can get practice questions from textbooks, past exams, talking to past students, or just Googling it. It's important that the practice questions you do are similar in format, style, and complexity to what you're actually going to see on the exam. For example, you wouldn't want to do multiple choice practice questions when the exam requires you to write an essay. Once you've found the right question sets and done them in exam-like conditions, you can take advantage of the most powerful part of practice questions, which is the analysis. You can see massive improvements when you consistently go through each question and figure out why you got it wrong, what content you didn't know, or how you should have approached it differently. This lets you see where you need to focus your time as you prep for an exam. Retrieval strategy number 4 is interleaving, which is switching between topics during a study session. Say, for example, that you have a 4-hour study block and there are 2 subjects you need to study, like biology and physics. Instead of dedicating 2 hours to biology and then 2 hours to physics, you interleave the subjects by doing 1 hour of biology, then physics, then back to biology and physics again. Interleaving has been shown not only to increase your efficiency while studying, but also the amount you end up retaining. I think that interleaving is really helpful, but I wouldn't set specific times when you need to start and stop studying certain topics. This is because when you're in a flow state studying a certain thing, abruptly switching to something else can end that flow state that you would have benefited from. What I prefer to do a lot more is noticing when you become distracted, bored, or out of your flow state. If you feel yourself getting distracted and you've already been studying a topic for 30 or 40 minutes, then move on to something else and come back to it later. If you haven't been studying for very long and you just can't get focused, it can be really helpful to use something called the Pomodoro method, which is part of strategy number 5, maintaining motivation. The Pomodoro method is effective when you feel less motivated to study because it pre-programs when you will work or study and when you will take breaks. For example, you might do 25-minute intervals of work and take 5-minute breaks between each one. This helps with low motivation because sitting down to study for 25 minutes sounds a lot better than sitting down to study for 4 hours. When I'm feeling motivated and can easily get into a flow state, I don't really use the Pomodoro method, but it's helpful when you don't feel like studying, especially if you plan to reward yourself with something you want to do when you get to a particular break. So part 4 of the study system is where everything comes together to form your daily routine, which includes 7 daily tactics you should consider adding. You definitely don't have to adopt all of these, but in my experience, they're really helpful if you want to maximize your ability to enter a flow state and do deep work. To put these into practice, we can jump back to our habit expert, James Clear, who gives 4 steps to easily make any habit. Make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying. You can apply each of these to the 7 daily tactics. First is to get at least 6 hours of sleep and wake up at the same time every day. Plenty of studies have found that getting enough sleep consistently is important for consolidating memory and focusing throughout the day. If you want to consistently perform well over time, you have to commit to this. Joko Willink, who's a former Navy SEAL, explains getting up in the morning as an expression of discipline that carries on throughout the entire day. If you win the battle of getting up when your alarm goes off, you're significantly more likely to do the next thing that requires discipline and the next thing. If you can get yourself to get up at the same time every day, you'll get into a rhythm and produce better results overall. To follow the habit-forming framework from James Clear, you can make it obvious by setting an alarm at the same time every day. Make it attractive by doing something you enjoy right when you wake up. Make it easy by keeping your alarm on the other side of the room, and make it satisfying by enjoying the time you have to yourself in the morning. Just do whatever you need to do to get enough sleep and get up at the same time every day. Second is to make time to work out every day. Research tells us that daily exercise is important for your mental and physical health. You don't have to go to the gym for hours every day. All you have to do is get moving. If you feel like you don't have the time, try and combine it with another part of your day that's passive, like listening to a podcast, an audiobook, or a lecture. You can voice journal about your day, meditate, or do anything that you would otherwise take time for at another point in the day. When I was really busy studying for the MCAT, I would set up an iPad on a treadmill and do my Anki flashcards while jogging. It's definitely not the most convenient, but you gotta do what you gotta do. Once you've convinced yourself that you can make time for it, follow the same 4 steps and make it obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. Third is to optimize your study space. This is mostly done by getting rid of any distractions and preventing interruptions. The first thing you can do is clear everything out that isn't directly related to studying, turn off all your notifications, put your phone out of reach, and get everything you need before you sit down to study. Studying in the same place where you can focus every day and only using that particular space for studying or working can help you get into studying mode faster. Over time, you build the habit of studying right when you enter that space, and that gives you a low mental startup cost. Establishing this automatic routine is one of the best things you can do for getting more studying done because it just feels natural. Tactic number 4 is to gamify your studying. Gamification is the strategic attempt to enhance systems, services, organizations, and activities by creating similar experiences to those experienced when playing games in order to motivate and engage users. When you feel motivated and engaged, studying becomes a lot more fun, which is the purpose of gamification. If you're a competitive person, one way you could do this is to create a score leaderboard with friends who are studying for the same exam. As you do practice questions, you're awarded a certain number of points based on your score. Then you can walk through the ones you got wrong and help each other understand the correct answers. There are tons of ways you can gamify your studying, so I'll leave a link to more ideas in the description of this video. Fifth is to plan 3 times. In reality, you can plan as much as you want, but I found that many high performers have 3 types of planning: project planning, weekly planning, and daily planning. Project planning involves writing out the high-level projects you have going on in your life, like a class you're taking or a broad goal like getting in shape, and then the specific tasks and resources you need as each of those progresses. This gives you an overview of all your priorities and how you can move the needle forward by taking action on each of them. Then you get to weekly planning, where you figure out how all of the tasks associated with your projects are going to fit into the limited time that you have every day. Once you have your week planned out, each morning or night you can make adjustments during a brief daily planning session. You review your priorities that day and then you execute them. Going through this process ensures that you use time as effectively as possible and know how to hold yourself accountable. Tactic number 6 is to put your agenda first. It's so important to defend your time against other people's agendas. When you wake up in the morning and go straight to your texts, your email, or whatever else, you're putting other people's agendas first. But when you get up and say, okay, what is the most important thing I need to get done today? And then do that thing immediately, you're putting your agenda first. You should definitely get back to people who have reached out to you, but that doesn't need to be the very first thing you do when you get up. Otherwise, you're already being reactive and not proactive. You also have to put your agenda first when other people ask you to do things. Your default response has to be no, because when something actually worthwhile comes around, you'll want to have the bandwidth to say yes. 7th is to take time to relax. When you're studying or doing anything at a really high intensity, you have to take breaks or you'll eventually burn out, which is worse than operating inefficiently because then you're just not doing anything. So take the time to do the things that leave you feeling recharged, re-energized, and ready to tackle whatever's coming up next. If you're particularly busy, you may have to plan this in advance, but take time to do something completely outside of studying or work and just enjoy it. Being outside, being with people you care about, or just doing something fun, all of these can boost your productivity and get you back to work. Let me know if I missed anything you do to get things done, and watch this video if you're studying for the MCAT right now.